Good morning, everybody. Do you have a favorite airline? Well, for years, one of the greats, reputation for service, for luxury even, was Pan Am. And it was on this date in 1991, December 4, that it had its last flight. One of the founders of Pan Am was Hap Arnold, who was a five-star general during World War II. He had known the Wright brothers, so he was involved in those early years of aviation, and the first flights taken by Pan Am delivered mail from Key West, Florida to Havana in Cuba. In this photo on the left you see Charles Lindbergh, who famously flew across the Atlantic by himself in 1927. So he was associated with Pan Am in those early days. 1935, Pan Am started its first flight across the Pacific, and this map shows the route, and you'll recognize some of those islands like Guam, Wake, and Midway as sites of ferocious fighting in World War II. So Pan Am had done some exploring in those islands in the 30s. 1939, Boeing came out with the 314 Clipper, and this became an iconic airplane for Pan Am. The Pan Am Clipper was what people knew. Here's a cutaway of it. It could hold 77 passengers and some in what was considered quite luxurious accommodations. During World War II, Pan Am was quite busy ferrying troops and supplies and really learned more and more about long-distance flying and the logistics behind that. And 2 years after World War II, it did its first around-the-world flight. And here's the airplane taking off to begin its flight around the world. And this map from the 1950s shows the Pan Am routes included is what became flight number 1, which went around the world. And I flew flight 1 in 1978 between Guam and Taipei when I left Micronesia. In 1958, Pan Am premiered the Boeing 707, which revolutionized air travel. Just a very crucial airplane. And by the time the 1960s rolled around, Pan Am was the #1 airline in the world. And its blue emblem, which you see here, was one of the most recognized brand names in the world. In 1963, Pan Am built the Pan Am building. It has that 1960s architecture, doesn't it? Kind of looks like the UN building. And it was the headquarters of Pan Am until our event. In 1964, when the Beatles flew to New York, they flew on Pan Am. And Pan Am had a reputation for being kind of a luxurious airline even. And then in 1970, Pan Am premiered the 747, which was a real stretch for Boeing, became one of the great airplanes ever. And here's some photograph of coach class in the early days of the 747. Looks pretty comfortable, doesn't it? A bit different than coach today. And then first class in the 747 was really something. And if you look at the back, you can see a little stairway because the 747 had that big bump at the top. So pretty luxurious, and most of the majors flew the 747. Well, 1973, the first big oil crisis happened. Gasoline became very expensive, so did aviation fuel. And that put a lot of pressure on the airlines. And then in 1978, during the Carter years, Congress deregulated the airlines. So airlines that were already kind of inefficient went under, and here's the list of the 4 big ones that did, including Pan Am. Eventually, it just couldn't compete with upstarts. Another thing that really hurt Pan Am was when some of its airplanes got hijacked. 1986, Flight 73 was hijacked in Pakistan, and then 2 years later, the Lockerbie bombing over Scotland was another Pan Am airplane. So on this date, December 4, in 1991, Pan Am had its last flight from Barbados to Florida, Miami. So it started and ended in Florida. So these are the major airlines today. Don't see Pan Am on the list, but in the history of airlines, Pan Am, one of the greats, a great legacy airline.